America's national parks are cathedrals of contradiction. Vast expanses where nature's grandeur unfurls in breathtaking vistas. Yet their silence presses against the senses like a living thing, heavy with secrets older than the trails that wind through them. Towering pines and gnarled oaks stand sentinel over rolling hills and jagged ravines, their roots sinking into soil that has drunk deep of time. Time that cradles both beauty and brutality in equal measure. For the hikers who venture here, backpacks slung over weary shoulders, boots crunching on pine needles, maps creased and sweat-stained. The wilderness promises refuge, a chance to shed the clamor of modern life and breathe free. But beneath the rustling leaves and the babble of streams lies a pulse, ancient and untamed, that thrums with the echoes of the lost, the hunted, and the hunting. In the spring and summer months of recent years, a scattering of souls, ordinary men seeking solace, adventure, or redemption, stepped into this duality and stumbled out with tales that claw at the edges of reason. These are not mere campfire yarns spun to thrill the restless or fleeting nightmares born of exhaustion. They are raw, unfiltered accounts of survival, carved into the earth with blood, bone, and the hollow gazes of those who lived to speak. This is the chronicle of trails that turned predator, a tapestry of terror woven through Shenandoah, Allegheny, Great Smoky Mountains, Lassen Volcanic, and Chattahoochee National Forests, where the boundary between man and monster frays, and the wild bears its jagged, unrelenting teeth. Jules and the Shenandoah Trap, a descent into the pit of madness. Shenandoah National Park sprawls across Virginia's Blue Ridge Mountains like a living dream, hills rolling into one another like the folds of a crumpled quilt, their slopes cloaked in forests of oak and pine, streams threading through the underbrush like silver veins glinting in the sunlight. On a late spring morning, Jules Ferrum and his hiking companion pulled into Thornton Gap, the gravel lot crunching beneath their tires, the air crisp with the scent of resin and the faint tang of dew still clinging to the grass. Jules, tall and lanky, his frame all angles and sinew, his jaw shadowed with a perpetual 5 o'clock stubble, climbed out of the car, thermos in hand, and spat into the gravel with a grimace. "This coffee tastes like dirt," he grumbled, his voice a familiar rasp roughened by years of shared exploits. Climbs up jagged cliffs, nights under star-strewn skies, days lost to the wild. His friend laughed, the sound sharp and bright against the stillness, rolling off the trees like a pebble skipped across a pond. "You want gourmet, hit a cafe. You want a real hike. This is it." The sky was a clear, piercing blue, the leaves just beginning to hint at autumn's gold. A perfect day to lose themselves in the embrace of Stony Man Trail. They slung their backpacks over their shoulders, the nylon straps creaking softly, water bottles sloshing in their side pockets, snacks packed tight, granola bars, trail mix, a couple of apples, enough for a week, though they planned only a day's trek. Jules was in high spirits, his long legs eating up the trail as he cracked jokes about their last misadventure. A rain-soaked debacle in the Adirondacks that left them shivering and swearing never again. His voice wove through the steady crunch of leaves underfoot, a thread of normalcy in the vastness. An hour in, they paused at a scenic overlook, the vista unfurling before them like a painting. Hills folding into dense forests, the horizon unbroken by a single human mark, the air so clear it seemed to hum with purity. Jules fumbled with his camera, the shutter clicking like a metronome as he captured the scene, while his companion leaned against a rock, biting into an apple, its tart juice a fleeting burst of life against the dry, cool breeze. "Ever think about getting lost out here?" Jules asked, squinting into the distance, his tone casual but laced with something heavier, something that lingered. "Find a stream, follow it downstream," came the reply, rote survival wisdom drilled into every hiker's mind. "Yeah, but what if something found you first?" Jules's words hung there, an edge to them that prickled the air, and his friend glanced over, catching a flicker of unease in those familiar hazel eyes. The trail steepened, the path climbing through a thickening stand of trees, pines stretching upward, their needles carpeting the ground, oaks twisting into gnarled shapes that cast long, cool shadows across the dirt. Silence settled over them, comfortable at first, a companionable quiet broken only by the rhythmic thud of their boots and the occasional skitter of squirrels darting through the underbrush. their tiny claws whispering against bark. 2 miles later, the trail forked. Left, a broad, well-trodden route marked with fresh signs, arrows painted in crisp white. Right, a narrow ribbon of earth swallowed by overgrown bushes, a faded wooden sign dangling from rusted nails, its letters weathered to illegibility. Jules grinned, mischief sparking in his gaze like a flare. Let's take the road less traveled. Bet we find something interesting. His friend hesitated, a twinge of doubt coiling in his gut. Years of hiking had taught him the value of caution. But Jules's enthusiasm was infectious, a pull too strong to resist. With a nod, they plunged into the underbrush, the forest closing around them like a fist, branches snagging at their packs, leaves brushing their faces with a damp, earthy chill. The path faded fast. Bushes thickened into a tangle of thorns and vines, the ground uneven with roots that rose like traps beneath the carpet of needles. After 15 minutes, the quiet turned oppressive, the canopy overhead choking out sunlight, leaving only a dim, greenish gloom that pressed against their eyes. The air grew heavy, thick with the musk of moss and the faint, sour rot of fallen logs. Maybe we should turn back, the friend suggested, voice tight, the words catching in his throat. Jules pushed ahead, undeterred, his long strides cutting through the undergrowth. "Where's your sense of adventure?" he called back, half laughing, though the sound felt swallowed by the trees. 20 minutes later, the trail was a memory, the forest a labyrinth of shadow and silence, every step a battle against the clinging vines and the weight of the unseen. Then Jules stopped, breath catching in his chest, his hand rising to point. "You see that?" Ahead, half hidden by a curtain of foliage, loomed a structure. An old cabin, its wood gray and rotting, windows shattered into jagged maws, door hanging precariously on a single rusted hinge, swaying faintly as if caught in a breath the forest didn't exhale. Excitement sparked in Jules's eyes, a gleam that drowned out the unease radiating from his companion. "Let's check it out," he said, voice alight with the thrill of discovery. The friend followed, reluctance dragging at his steps, every instinct screaming to turn back. The cabin reeked of decay, musty air thick with dampness and the faint, acrid bite of mold, the floorboards groaning under their weight, splintered furniture strewn across a single room like the wreckage of a forgotten life. In the center, a trapdoor gaped slightly, its edges splintered and worn, a sliver of darkness peeking through the crack. "Someone had a secret," Jules said, glee threading his words like a child unwrapping a gift. His friend's stomach nodded, a cold fist tightening around his insides. "Maybe we should leave it that way." But Jules was already prying it open, fingers curling around the rough wood, the hinges shrieking as it swung wide to reveal a set of wooden stairs descending into a blackness so deep it seemed to swallow the light. Jules grabbed his flashlight from his pack, its beam a frail spear against the dark, and started down, his boots thudding on the creaking steps. "Jules, wait!" his friend called, voice sharp with panic. But Jules was already halfway gone, a silhouette swallowed by the shadows below. With a curse under his breath, the friend followed, the air growing colder with every step, heavier, pressing against his chest like a damp hand. At the bottom, the flashlight carved a narrow path through a small underground room. Shelves lined the walls, sagging under the weight of jars and boxes, their surfaces coated in a shroud of dust that shimmered faintly in the beam. "Storage? Storm shelter," Jules mused, his voice echoing in the confined space as he opened a box, revealing a jumble of old tools, rusted pliers, a chipped hammer, canned food swollen with age, and strange artifacts. Bone fragments etched with crude lines, carved stones that felt warm to the touch, relics of a time or purpose long forgotten. The friend's gaze drifted to the wall, where tally marks scratched into the wood caught the light, dozens of them, methodical and chilling, stretching in rows that seemed to count something lost to the dark. "Someone was keeping track," Jules said, his tone shifting, curiosity warring with a flicker of doubt. Footsteps thudded above, heavy and deliberate, reverberating through the ceiling like a drumbeat. The trapdoor creaked, its groan a slow, mournful wail, and a figure loomed at the top of the stairs, tall, wild-haired, clad in ragged clothes that hung off his frame like tattered flags, a shotgun dangling loosely from one hand, its barrel glinting faintly in the dim light. "Who the hell are you?" he growled, his voice a gravelly scrape, raw and jagged as if torn from a throat and used to words. "Just hikers," the friend stammered, hands rising instinctively. "We got lost. Found this place by accident." The man's eyes narrowed, suspicion hardening his weathered features into a mask of distrust, his lips curling back to reveal yellowed teeth. "You're trespassing," he spat, the word a condemnation. Jules raised his hands, palms out, his usual bravado faltering. "Sorry, didn't mean to." The man cut him off with a snarl, a sound more animal than human. Too late for that. Without warning, he fired into the ceiling, the blast deafening in the cramped space, dust and splinters raining down like ash. They ducked, hearts slamming against their ribs, the air thick with the acrid bite of gunpowder. "Get up here," he ordered, the shotgun's barrel jerking upward, a cold promise etched in its steel. They climbed, the stairs creaking under their weight, each step a slow march toward an unknown fate, the man's shadow looming larger with every rung. At the top, he motioned them to sit on the cabin floor, the wood cold and splintered against their palms. With a heavy padlock, he sealed the trapdoor, its click a death knell that echoed in the silence. "Who sent you?" he demanded, pacing like a caged beast, the shotgun swinging loosely in his grip. "No one," they insisted, voices overlapping in a frantic chorus of desperation. "We just got lost, I swear." He muttered to himself, words tumbling over one another, paranoia threading his thoughts like a wire pulled taut, his eyes darting to the windows as if expecting unseen watchers. Then, with a sharp jerk of the gun, he herded them outside, the fading light casting the forest in shades of menace, the trees standing like silent sentinels over a world gone wrong. They walked for hours, deeper into the wild, the man's presence a shadow at their backs, the shotgun's weight a constant threat. The forest thickened, branches clawing at their clothes, roots rising to trip their aching legs. Jules's usual chatter faded, his eyes darting for an escape that never materialized, his lanky frame hunched under the strain. The friend's mind raced, every step a search for a plan, a chance, anything to break free. But the wild offered no mercy, only an endless maze of green and gray. At last, they reached a clearing, and a pit yawned before them. 10 feet deep, its walls smooth and unclimbable, the earth dark and damp at its base. "Climb down," the man commanded, his voice flat, the shotgun leaving no room for defiance. They slid into the dark, hands scraping against the cold dirt, the pit swallowing them whole. "Stay here, I'll be back," he said, his silhouette vanishing into the trees, leaving them trapped in a hole that smelled of rot and despair. Night fell hard, the temperature plunging, the forest silent save for the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant hoot of an owl, its call a mournful note in the blackness. They huddled together, breath fogging in the chill, panic clawing at their chests like a living thing. Hours stretched, the sky a void above, until a rhythmic thumping broke the stillness, louder, closer, a sound that vibrated through the earth into their bones. The man returned, dragging a large sack behind him, its bulk thudding against the ground. With a grunt, he hurled it into the pit. It landed with a sickening crunch and something inside groaned, a low, pained sound that froze their blood. "Enjoy your last night," he sneered, his voice dripping with malice. And then he was gone, the forest swallowing him as completely as it had their hope. The sack writhed, a muffled plea escaping its folds. "Help me." Fingers trembling, they untied it, revealing a young woman, Liza, battered and bruised, her eyes wide with terror, her voice a whisper scraped raw. "He's kept me prisoner for weeks," she said, wincing as she sat up, her clothes torn, her skin marked with the ghosts of violence. "Do you know a way out?" Jules asked, desperation sharpening his words. She shook her head, a single tear cutting through the grime on her cheek. "No, but we have to find one. He'll kill us all." They searched the pit, hands fumbling in the dark, until Jules found a loose rock, jagged, heavy. They dug at the walls, scraping at the earth with bleeding fingers, every gouge a prayer for freedom. The work was slow, exhausting, their hands raw and slick with blood and dirt, but desperation fueled them, a fire against the cold creeping into their bones. Dawn neared, the sky lightening to a bruised gray, and footsteps returned, slow, deliberate, a harbinger of death. The man loomed above, shotgun raised, his sneer a blade in the half-light. "Trying to escape?" he taunted, leveling the barrel at them. A crack split the air, not his gun, but a rifle's sharp report. Blood bloomed on his chest, a crimson flower spreading fast. He stumbled, eyes wide with shock, and toppled into the pit, landing with a sickening crunch, his lifeless gaze staring into the void. A park ranger stood at the edge, rifle in hand, his voice cutting through the haze. "Are you guys all right?" He tossed down a rope, pulling them free one by one. Jules, his friend, Liza, each trembling as they emerged into the dawn. The truth unraveled later, pieced together by police and rangers who swarmed the clearing. The man was a killer, wanted for years, his victims buried in shallow graves scattered through Shenandoah's depths. Liza had been one of many, her survival a fluke of timing. Jules and his friend drove away, the car's hum a lifeline back to civilization, their silence thick with the weight of what they'd endured. The forest's call, once a song of freedom, now echoed with the clatter of a padlock, the thud of a sack, the snarl of a man whose madness had nearly claimed them. Lucien Tromble, the waterfall's dark secret in Shenandoah. Shenandoah's Blue Ridge Mountains rose like ancient sentinels under a brilliant spring sky as Lucien Tromble parked his battered hatchback at a remote trailhead. The solitude a balm to a soul worn thin by the monotony of office life. Endless spreadsheets, flickering fluorescent lights, a boss whose voice grated like sandpaper. A solo hiker by passion, he craved these escapes. The crisp air filling his lungs, the towering trees a cathedral of green that drowned out the city's clamor. His gear was packed tight: water, food, a first aid kit, a map folded into a weathered leather case, and he set off at dawn, the trail winding through a canopy of oak and pine that filtered sunlight into a soft, dappled glow, dancing across the earth like fleeting spirits. Hours passed in a steady rhythm, boots thudding on packed dirt, breath syncing with the rise and fall of the path, the occasional chirp of a bird or rustle of a deer threading through the stillness. Around mid-morning, he reached a clearing, the panoramic view stopping him cold. Hills stretching endlessly below, their slopes a patchwork of green and gray, the sky a piercing blue that seemed to hum with clarity. He sipped water from his canteen, the cold liquid a shock against his dry throat, and savored the peace, the silence wrapping around him like a cloak. His map crinkled as he unfolded it, fingers tracing a lesser-known path, an overgrown spur promising a hidden waterfall, a gem unmarked on tourist brochures. The lure of discovery tugged at him, a quiet thrill, and he veered off the main trail, plunging into the wild with a grin. The path narrowed fast, underbrush thickening into a tangle of ferns and thorns that snagged at his clothes, their barbs leaving faint scratches on his arms. The air grew cooler, the canopy denser, sunlight fading to a dim, emerald haze that pressed against his eyes. An hour later, a faint rush of water quickened his pulse, pulling him forward through the brambles. The waterfall emerged like a vision, crystal cascades tumbling over moss-covered rocks into a pristine pool, its surface shimmering with refracted light, the mist rising in delicate curls that caught the faint rays piercing the trees. Lucien sank onto a boulder, the stone cool against his legs, and let the tranquility wash over him, the steady roar of the falls a lullaby that drowned out the world. He closed his eyes, breathing deep, the scent of wet earth and pine filling his lungs. Then he saw it. A campfire ring, its stones blackened and cracked, firewood stacked neatly nearby in a pyramid too precise to be accidental. Someone had been here recently. Curiosity flared, overriding the faint prickle of unease at the back of his neck. He slid off the boulder and approached, boots sinking into the damp soil, the air tinged with the faint char of old embers. A worn backpack leaned against a tree, its faded green canvas streaked with mud, its contents spilling slightly. A rolled sleeping bag, a dented tin cup, a coil of rope. Nothing personal, just the detritus of a camper's life. He crouched, fingers brushing the fabric, when a noise, a rustle sharp and sudden, snapped him upright. "Who's there?" he called, voice cutting through the stillness, his head whipping around to scan the trees. A man emerged from the shadows, tall, lean, his frame gaunt beneath a tangle of scraggly hair that framed a wild, unshaven face. His clothes torn and streaked with dirt, boots caked in mud that flaked with every step. His eyes glinted, sharp and unblinking, a predator's gaze that pinned Lucian in place. "Didn't mean to scare you," he said, raising his hands in a placating gesture, though the motion felt rehearsed, hollow. "Wasn't expecting company out here." Lucian steadied his voice, forcing calm into the words. "This your camp?" "Yeah, been here a bit. Name's Tom," the man replied, his tone flat, his eyes never leaving Lucian's face. Small talk faltered. Lucian asked about the weather, the trails, but Tom's answers were clipped, evasive, his gaze darting to the trees as if tracking something unseen. The air thickened, tension coiling tight, and Lucian's instincts screamed to move. "Well, better get going," he said, forcing a smile that felt like a grimace. "Nice meeting you, Tom." Tom nodded, his stare unblinking, following Lucian as he backed away toward the trail. The forest turned ominous, its peace shattered into fragments. Lucian hiked fast, boots pounding the earth, his breath quickening with every glance over his shoulder, half expecting Tom's gaunt silhouette to materialize behind him. The trees loomed taller, their branches clawing at the sky, the light dimming as the afternoon bled into dusk. He pushed deeper, the path twisting through a maze of roots and rocks, until exhaustion forced him to stop. In a small clearing, he pitched his tent, the nylon rustling as he drove the stakes into the soft earth, and built a fire, its crackle a frail shield against the dark. Sleep came fitfully, dreams tangled with the rustle of leaves and the echo of Tom's voice, until a sharper sound, twigs snapping nearby, jerked him awake, heart pounding like a drum against his ribs. He grabbed his flashlight, its beam trembling in his grip, and stepped outside, the fire's embers glowing faintly behind him. "Who's there?" he called, voice shaking, the words swallowed by the night. The beam swept the trees, revealing nothing but shadows that danced and twisted in the flickering light. Then, a low chuckle, soft and guttural, slithering from the dark. Panic surged, a cold wave crashing through him. He snatched his pack, abandoning the tent, and ran, the flashlight's beam bouncing wildly as he tore through the forest. Footsteps followed, fast, relentless, crashing through the underbrush with a weight that shook the ground. He tripped, sprawling into the dirt, roots digging into his palms as he scrambled up, breath ragged. Tom loomed from the shadows, a cruel smile twisting his face, eyes glinting with malice. "Running won't help," he said, voice dripping with a dark promise. "You should have stayed put." They grappled, Lucian clawing at Tom's face, kicking at his legs, but Tom's strength was feral, overwhelming, his hands closing around Lucian's throat with a grip like iron. Vision blurred, the world narrowing to a pinprick. Then a crack, sharp and sudden. Tom jerked back, blood seeping from his temple, a stranger standing over him, a heavy branch clutched in trembling hands. "Get up! We need to go!" the man shouted, voice raw with urgency. Lucian stumbled to his feet, gasping, the stranger, Jack, grabbing his arm and pulling him away. They ran, the forest a blur of green and black, until they burst into a ranger station, the harsh light of its interior a lifeline after the dark. Jack panted, words tumbling out. "He's been out here months, maybe longer. People have gone missing. I've been tracking him." Rangers arrived, their radios crackling as they took statements, skepticism giving way to grim resolve when they saw Lucian's bruises, the blood on his hands. They found Tom's camp later, belongings scattered, shallow graves nearby, evidence of a predator who'd turned the wild into his hunting ground. Lucian drove away, the road humming beneath his tires, relief shadowed by a lingering dread. The forest, once his sanctuary, now whispered with the memory of Tom's smile, the choke of his hands, a scar etched into the quiet he'd once loved. Neil Jablonski, the Allegheny Knife and the Drifter's Lair. Allegheny National Forest in Pennsylvania greeted Neil Jablonski with a quiet that felt like a gift, dense woods swallowing the trailhead, moss softening his steps, the air thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. A man weathered by life, debts piling up like storm clouds, jobs slipping through his fingers like sand. He sought solace here, parking his pickup at an empty lot under a canopy of slivered sunlight that pierced the towering trees. The morning was still, the forest a cathedral of green and brown, and he set off with his backpack slung low, the weight a comforting anchor against the chaos he'd left behind. An hour in, an oddity stopped him cold. A rusted truck, its frame half hidden by overgrown bushes, windows shattered into jagged webs, paint peeling in flakes that littered the ground like shed skin. Nearby sprawled a campsite, a fire pit ringed with blackened stones, rusted cooking pots tipped on their sides, a moldy sleeping bag sagging under the weight of dew. Abandoned, yet lived in. The scene prickled his skin with unease, a shiver of something wrong threading through the stillness. His stomach turned, but curiosity, sharp and insistent, drove him closer. He snapped photos with his phone, the clicks loud in the silence, planning to share the find with friends later, a tale to spin over beers. Under the truck, something glinted, a rusty knife, its blade crusted with dried blood, dark and flaking, the handle worn smooth by use. Neil's pulse quickened, a jolt of adrenaline spiking through him. He'd seen enough crime shows to know this wasn't random junk. This was evidence, a relic of violence etched into the steel. A twig snapped behind him, sharp and sudden. He spun, eyes darting across the trees, seeing nothing but their watchful silhouettes, branches swaying faintly in a breeze he couldn't feel. He shoved the knife into his pack, its weight a cold promise against his spine, and hurried back to the trail, senses razor-sharp, every rustle a threat. The forest closed in, oppressive, the canopy thickening until the light was a dim, gray haze, the air heavy with the musk of decay. Footsteps, unmistakable now, followed, deliberate and heavy, crunching through the underbrush with a rhythm that matched his racing heart. He turned, breath-catching, and there he was, a man, tall and lanky, greasy hair hanging in tangles over a gaunt face, clothes unwashed and ragged, a machete dangling from his hand, its blade glinting dully in the filtered light. His eyes were wild, glinting with a hunger that pinned Neil in place. "Hey!" Neil shouted, voice steady despite the tremor in his chest. "What do you want?" The man grinned, a chilling, toothy slash across his face, and said nothing, advancing with a slow, predatory grace. Neil ran, the forest blurring into a smear of green and brown, branches whipping his face, roots snagging his boots. The man crashed behind, relentless, the thud of his steps a drumbeat of pursuit. Neil's lungs burned, his legs ached, but fear drove him forward, a primal surge that drowned out pain. Ahead loomed a rocky outcrop, jagged stones rising from the earth like the spine of some ancient beast. He veered off the trail, scrambling up the rocks, hands scraping raw against their edges, blood slicking his palms as he climbed. At the top, he crouched behind a boulder, chest heaving, trying to quiet his ragged breaths. Minutes stretched, the forest silent save for the faint drip of blood from his hands onto the stone. Then, a crunch, footsteps on the rocks below, slow and deliberate. The man's face appeared around the boulder, that same terrifying grin plastered across it. His voice a sing-song taunt. "Found you." The machete rose, gleaming in the dim light. Instinct took over. Neil grabbed a loose rock, its weight cold and solid, and swung with all his strength. It connected with the man's head, a sickening thud echoing through the trees. He stumbled back, the machete clattering to the stone. Neil lunged, snatching the blade, its handle slick with sweat and blood, and ran, sliding down the rocks, boots pounding the trail as he fled. The forest blurred again, a tunnel of green and gray, until he burst into the parking lot, his truck a beacon of safety. He jumped in, locked the doors, and sped out, tires squealing on the gravel, not stopping until he reached a small-town police station miles away. The knife and machete clattered onto the desk as he poured out his story, words tumbling over one another, the officer's skepticism giving way to grim focus when he saw the blood, the weapons. They found the campsite, the truck, shallow graves nearby, a drifter's killing ground hidden in Allegheny's depths. The man was identified, wanted, violent, a ghost who'd preyed on hikers for years. Neil left town, the forest's peace shattered, vowing caution on every trail ahead. The glint of that machete a scar he'd carry forever. Wesley Craven, the Smoky Mountain Hermit's Lair. Great Smoky Mountains National Park unfurled in rugged splendor as Wesley Craven hiked solo, seeking solace after a breakup that left his heart raw and work setbacks that gnawed at his pride. The trail was blissful, leaves rustling in a gentle breeze, birds chirping their staccato songs, the air crisp with the scent of pine and the faint musk of damp earth. His backpack hung heavy with essentials: water, snacks, a first aid kit, the rhythm of his footsteps a balm to his frayed nerves. Around noon, he paused by a small creek, its waters gurgling over smooth stones, and sat on a rock, munching a granola bar, the sweetness of fleeting comfort. A man approached from the opposite direction, tall, bearded, his weathered face carved with lines of hard living, a hunting knife gleaming on his belt. His clothes were dirty, patched with stains, and his piercing eyes locked onto Wesley with an intensity that prickled his skin. "Hey there," Wesley greeted with a nod, forcing casualness into his tone. The man stared, silent for a beat too long, then muttered, "Nice day for a hike, huh?" "Sure is," Wesley replied, unease coiling in his gut. "You been out here long?" "Long enough," the man said, and without another word, he moved on, his boots thudding softly on the trail. Wesley watched him go, a chill running down his spine, but he shook it off. Another hiker, nothing more. By late afternoon, he'd reached a remote stretch, far from the well-trodden paths, the forest thickening into a maze of shadows. Snapped branches littered the trail, their breaks fresh and jagged, and a faint, unpleasant stench, metallic, sour, hung in the air. The sun dipped low, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, and Wesley realized he'd ventured too far to make it back by dusk. He found a clearing and pitched his tent, the nylon rustling as he drove the stakes into the soft earth, then built a fire, its crackle a frail shield against the encroaching dark. The woods were eerily quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, only the hiss of the flames and the thud of his own heartbeat. He tried to sleep, exhaustion tugging at him, but unease kept his eyes open, darting to the shadows beyond the firelight. Every snap of a twig, every whisper of wind, made his nerves flare, his hand resting on the small knife at his side. A pitiful defense, but all he had. Around midnight, a sound pierced the silence. A low, guttural moan, rising from the direction he'd seen the strange man earlier. It wasn't an animal, not quite human. A noise that clawed at his instincts, pulling him upright. He grabbed his flashlight and knife, stepping cautiously out of the tent, the beam trembling as it swept the trees. The moan grew louder, more distinct, a thread of anguish woven into its depths. Against every shred of reason, he followed it, boots crunching on pine needles, heart pounding in his chest like a trapped bird. The sound led him to a small, makeshift shelter hidden among the trees, poles lashed together with frayed rope, draped with tattered tarps. The sight that greeted him was a nightmare. Scattered bones, human and animal, gleaming white against the blood-stained ground. Tattered clothes shredded into ribbons, a stench of rot and iron thick enough to choke on. His stomach churned, bile rising in his throat, and he stumbled back, mind racing to make sense of the carnage. Before he could flee, a hand clamped over his mouth from behind, rough and calloused, stifling his scream. The man from the creek pressed close, his breath hot and sour against Wesley's ear. "You shouldn't have come here," he whispered, voice a blade of ice. Wesley struggled, elbows flailing, but the grip was iron, dragging him into the shelter, throwing him to the ground. His flashlight rolled away, casting erratic beams across the grim scene. Bones glinting, blood pooling in the dirt. The man loomed over him, knife in hand, eyes wild with madness, a predator savoring its catch. "Please," Wesley gasped, voice breaking. "I just want to leave." The man laughed, a cruel, mocking sound that echoed off the trees. "Leave? You're not going anywhere." He lunged, blade slashing downward. Wesley rolled, the steel grazing his arm, pain flaring hot and bright. He grabbed a branch, swinging it with desperate strength, cracking it across the man's face. The man staggered, blood trickling from his nose, and Wesley scrambled to his feet, bolting into the dark. The forest swallowed him, branches tearing at his clothes and skin, the man's curses crashing behind. Wesley ran, lungs burning, legs trembling, until he burst onto a familiar trail, the dim moonlight guiding him back to the parking lot. He fumbled with his keys, hands shaking, and threw himself into his car, locking the doors as the engine roared to life. In the rear view, he saw the man emerge, a dark silhouette against the night, knife glinting. Wesley sped to a ranger station, words tumbling out in a frantic rush, blood dripping from his arm onto the floor. The rangers were skeptical at first, but his injuries forced action. They found the shelter, the remains, victims of a deranged hermit, a wanted criminal who'd lived off the grid, preying on the unwary. Captured days later, his reign ended, but Wesley's sanctuary was lost, the Smokies' beauty forever stained with the memory of those wild eyes. Jory Sanger, the Lassen Hunters Ravine. Lassen Volcanic National Park's trails stretched before Jory Sanger like a promise of peace. A week-long escape from a grinding job and a relationship with Sarah teetering on the edge. She wanted kids, he wasn't sure, and the tension had carved a rift too deep to bridge. The forest was serene, sunlight filtering through the canopy in dappled patterns, the wind whispering through the pines, the terrain a challenge that steadied his restless mind. He set off early, backpack heavy with gear, the solitude wrapping around him like a second skin. The hike started well, trails winding past steaming vents and bubbling springs, the air crisp with the scent of sulfur and earth. He passed a few hikers, exchanging nods, their voices fading as the crowd thinned, leaving him alone with the wild. At a fork, the left path led back to the visitor center, safe and familiar. The right promised rugged adventure, its narrow thread vanishing into overgrown brush. Feeling bold, Jory chose the right, the forest closing in, trees standing tall and silent, their branches forming a canopy that blocked the sun, casting the world in a dim, greenish twilight. The deeper he went, the quieter it grew. No birds, no rustling leaves, only an eerie stillness that pressed against his ears. A torn piece of red cloth snagged on a branch fluttered in the breeze, bright against the muted green, its edges frayed but fresh. A chill ran down his spine. Another hiker, he reasoned, but the silence was too thick, too absolute. The trail faded, underbrush clawing at his legs, progress slow and laborious. Then he stumbled into a campsite. Overturned tent, scattered belongings, a smoldering campfire ringed with stones. Blood stained the ground, dark and glistening, the metallic scent hanging heavy in the air. Panic surged, a cold wave crashing through him. He should have turned back, but something, morbid curiosity, a need to understand, held him rooted. A rustling broke the silence, faint at first, then louder, coming from the foliage to his left. He froze, ears straining, the sound growing into footsteps. Quick, uneven. A figure burst through. A man, clothes torn and bloodied, eyes wild with fear. "Help me!" he gasped, collapsing at Jory's feet, hands clawing at the dirt. "He's out there, he's coming!" Before Jory could speak, a low, guttural laugh echoed through the trees, chilling and close. The man's eyes widened, terror twisting his face. "Run!" he screamed, scrambling up. Jory grabbed his arm, pulling him along, and they ran, crashing through the forest, branches snapping, leaves exploding in their wake. The laughter followed, a relentless shadow weaving through the trees. They stumbled into a clearing, the sudden brightness blinding. The man fell, gasping. "We can't stop, he'll find us." Jory scanned the emptiness. Trees, rocks, no refuge. "Who is he?" he demanded. The man's face twisted in anguish. "A monster, a hunter, he killed my friends." The laughter returned, echoing off the trees, and a figure emerged. Tall, clad in tattered clothes, his face obscured by a makeshift mask of burlap and twine, a hunting knife glinting in his hand. The man beside Jory screamed, bolting, but the hunter moved with terrifying speed, tackling him, the blade plunging into his back. Screams filled the clearing, a haunting wail that seared into Jory's mind. He ran, feet pounding the earth, breath ragged, the hunter's footsteps crashing behind. A ravine loomed ahead. Jory slid down its slope, rocks cutting his skin, and found a narrow cave, squeezing inside, curling into the dark. The footsteps stopped above, silence stretching into eternity, until they faded. Dawn broke as he emerged, bruised and bleeding, following a stream through the night until a cabin offered shelter. Then a trail led to safety. Rangers found the bodies, confirmed the hunter's spree, but he vanished, a specter still lurking. Jory's peace was a memory, the wild's call now a scream. Clayton Beringer, the Chattahoochee Cabin of Blood. Chattahoochee National Forest's beauty drew Clayton Beringer, a thrill-seeker tired of urban games, craving the challenge of Georgia's wilds. The forest was idyllic, dense with gurgling streams, sunlight dappling the leaves, until a hidden path lured him deeper, its silence oppressive. A dilapidated cabin emerged, windows shattered, door creaking. Its interior musty, a blood-stained table and rusted chains at its heart. Symbols scrawled in dried blood on the walls. A gaunt man with wild eyes attacked, machete gleaming. Clayton fled, pursued, escaping to report the horror. Rangers found the cabin, empty, the man gone. A nightmare uncaught, waiting. What would you do, reader, if you stood at the threshold of those woods, the air thick with whispers and unseen eyes? Could you bear the weight of their secrets? Or would you flee, leaving the shadows to fester? The forbidden excavation dares you to imagine, because some stories don't end with the dawn. They linger, threading through the dark, waiting for the next soul to listen.